Naz, delighted to welcome now to Talk Today Live, Trevor Kavanagh, legendary Sun columnist. And before we talk about many other things, let's react to that breaking news, Trevor. That teenage girl, Yahal, 13, confirmed as dead in those Hamas attacks, a British citizen. No news about her sister and father, Eli, still missing. Your response to that, Trevor?
Well, it's yet another tragic, appalling act of violence by a terrorist group against innocent civilians. And the evidence is really, as I say, blood-curdling, and it's fascinating to see just what an impact it has on those who are at the workface on this, in the hospitals, bursting into tears as they have to deal with the aftermath of that terrorist attack on so many children and adults. It's the sort of thing that is almost impossible for people like us who live in a city like this to grasp. Although here in London Bridge we've experienced it very closely not so many years ago. But it is something that makes you realise what is at stake now, and it's huge.
Is that going to change the stakes now for the UK and our government's response to what's happening in Israel?
I don't think it can. I think we're totally committed to supporting Israel. And for good reason, because this was an unprovoked attack by terrorists against innocent civilians. How do you deal with that other than to back the country that is trying to defend itself from these attacks? And it's also very interesting that you've now got the President of the United States, the leader of the world's biggest superpower, flying at short notice to a country which is clearly on the brink of something potentially quite disastrous if things go wrong. There is a lot at stake here, and the presence of American aircraft carriers and British forces makes us realise just how easily we could slip into something quite lethal.
I think that's the point, Trevor. I think, 10 days ago when we first reported these atrocities, and I was very vocal and will continue to be so. I think it's an utter terrorist attack. I don't believe there was enough condemnation. We were quite rightly watching all those social commentators jumping up and down about George Floyd, quite rightly, and the Ukraine. But I almost felt... We had a girl on, didn't we? Georgia Barnett, first guest on 10 days ago. And the emotion in her voice, Trevor, when she said, "This takes me and my family and everybody who's Jewish back 70 years. That does not negate, of course, Israel has a right to get its hostages back and right the wrongs. But, of course, we're now talking on a worldwide scale globally what could be a huge humanitarian problem inside Gaza. We know, we said yesterday, more tunnels in the London Underground. Hamas are a terrorist organisation. Their main headquarters allegedly built underneath a children's hospital. Tells you everything. Yes, we can absolutely support Israel. I do very fervently, but what about what's next? Because Iran presumably has something to do with it. Hezbollah or Egypt aren't opening the border. This could really escalate, Trevor, couldn't it?
I think it's absolutely almost certain to escalate. I cannot see how it can now be contained unless Israel simply comes to a halt and calls back the IDF and says, we're not going any further. They can hold the ground where they've occupied it, but that's just a perpetual infection that will never heal. And I find it difficult to see quite how we move forward on this, because you have, as we saw on the weekend across the streets of London and major cities in Britain, very, very large numbers of pro-Palestinian demonstrators, not many pro-Israeli demonstrators. And that is the case right across Europe. And now you have this shooting in Denmark, and this can only escalate, in my view. I think it's almost impossible to keep the lid on this because of the passions on both sides.
Fanaticism?
I think, to take both of your points, what you said about social commentators maybe not being as quick as you would hope to support Israel, and also the lack of a march for Israel. I think it's probably quite important to state that people should not be, and I don't believe are, of course there's going to be a minority, supporting the terrorist activity. There's very little we can do to protest against that. It is outright wrong. However, Israel is a state, and we have a responsibility as citizens of the UK and the UK government to hold a legitimate state to account, to make sure that they respond, yes, to the horrendous acts of Hamas, but within line within the
law.
lines of international law.
And they are
they
are within international law, I believe. I could be wrong, but I think their response. But the fact, as Trevor says, the fact that the US president has flown there, the fact there are aircraft carriers, to me says, yeah, absolutely, they should be within, absolutely 1,000,000% behind you. But what I can't get past, and it's quite a difficult thing to talk about, isn't it? Yeah. I can't get past. You know, people say, well, you know, it's going to be awful. And it is. I absolutely accept that. And I don't want any loss of life. I think any children, but I think it's appalling. But the terrorist activities of 10 days ago, that musical festival, what they did, that is not militancy. That is ISIS-like what they did to babies, isn't it, Trevor? That's beyond the pale. That has to be dealt with, doesn't it?
Yes, and it is being compared in my small version of the Holocaust. It's attempting to wipe out the Israeli people and the Israeli state. And the problem is, I think, Nicola, that although there is only a small minority, it's a significant and very vocal minority, which is certainly drowning out the support that should be there for Israel.
Yeah.
And I think this is dangerous. And it's not just in Britain, as I say. There is a very significant Muslim population across Europe, something like 25%. And they are of a sort of disposition which is prepared to go out and actually demonstrate in very vigorous forms for what they stand for, whereas the the Israelis have virtually no support among people actually waving banners or shouting.
Yeah, I think for me, because I went to see the protest on Saturday, curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to know what was going on. And for me, I think it was very friendly and for all intents and purposes. Yes, there were an awful lot.
Nobody was shouting death to the Jews.
No, wait. There was an awful lot of families there. No, I think that was what was taking place in Sydney. But yes, there were individuals. There are always going to be individuals in these crowds doing that. However, there is a concern, isn't there? Because we've seen the messaging change over the past week. We've had Starmer, we've had Sunak. Yeah, everybody going from Israel absolutely has a right to defend herself no matter what, essentially.
To yes, but,
which was the change yesterday. Yes, but, OK, where does it end? And that's the question I want to ask is, where does this end? OK, they invade Gaza, there's a ground assault on the northern part of Gaza, but then does it move to the south? Where does it end?
I'm afraid I'm very pessimistic. I don't see how it can end, and if it does end, it will end badly.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Can I ask him one thing?
Of course you can.
Is that all right? Just very quickly. The BBC. I mean, we've been talking about this all morning, talking about not reading the room. It is beyond my comprehension that the BBC, the fence sitters, just my bugbear, can't call Hamas terrorists. Your quick response, Trevor Kavanagh.
Well, I think when even Archbishop Welby, of all people, is calling on the BBC to describe them as terrorists, then I think they should respond. And indeed, I heard someone on the news last night calling them a terror group. So maybe that's the beginning.
Yeah, maybe that's the change. Well, thank you so much for
thank you, my friend.
See you again soon.